Maid's daughter used her last $5 to help an old veteran. Next day, 100 Navy SEALs knocked on her door. The wind howled off the Pacific that night, turning Port Madison's narrow streets into corridors of ice. Streetlights flickered against the fog, and salt spray from the bay stung the skin. On a corner bench sat an old man in a threadbare navy coat, his hands trembling as he tried to warm them with his breath. Across the street, a small figure watched him. Grace Carter, 10 years old, clutched a $5 bill in her mittened hand. It was all she and her mother had left until payday. Her shoes were thin, her backpack frayed, but her eyes, bright and blue like the frozen sea, burned with something fierce. She'd been saving that money for a book she saw in the shop window on Main Street, The Secret Garden. Her teacher said reading built worlds no one could take away. But now, watching the old man's shoulders shake, the words of her late great-grandfather echoed in her mind. A soldier never leaves his own behind. Grace crossed the street before she could talk herself out of it. The snow bit through her socks as she ran to the little diner at the corner, the one that smelled like coffee and bacon grease, and used her last $5 to buy a bowl of beef stew and a thick slice of bread. The waitress tried to give her a discount, but Grace shook her head. "No, ma'am, he needs it hot." When she returned, the old man looked up in confusion as the child placed the steaming bowl in his hands. "I didn't ask for charity," he muttered, ashamed. "It's not charity," she said firmly. "It's dinner. My great-grandpa was a Navy man, too. He said good men deserve to eat warm." For a long moment, the old man just stared at her. Then, slowly, he smiled, a weary, cracked smile that somehow reached his eyes. "You remind me of someone," he said softly, before taking the first careful bite. Grace stood there until he finished, her heart swelling with warmth that no blanket could match. When she walked home that night, her stomach was empty, but her soul felt full. She didn't know it yet, but that $5 act of kindness had just lit a signal flare seen all the way across the ocean. By dawn, the fog had lifted, but Helen Carter's small apartment above the docks still felt heavy with cold and worry. The heater had gone out again, and the kitchen table was cluttered with overdue bills and a folded eviction notice. Helen sat staring at it, her eyes red from a sleepless night. When Grace tiptoed in, snow melting off her coat, Helen managed a tired smile. "You're up early, sweetheart. Did you sleep?" Grace hesitated. "Not much. I saw a man last night by the bay. He was cold, Mom. I used the $5 to get him soup." Helen's face fell. She pressed her hand to her mouth, trying to steady herself. "Grace," her voice cracked, too soft to be anger, too full of fear to be calm. "That was our grocery money. We don't get paid until Friday." "I know." Grace looked down. "But he was freezing, Mom. He looked like Grandpa James in that old photo, the one in the Navy uniform." For a long time, Helen said nothing. She looked at her daughter, this little girl who had her father's stubborn heart and her grandfather's courage, and something inside her broke. She pulled Grace close, holding her tightly. "You did the right thing," she whispered through tears. "But right things don't always come easy." They sat like that until the kettle whistled. Helen poured them each a cup of weak tea, her hands trembling. The apartment smelled faintly of salt and rust, the wallpaper peeling at the corners. Life hadn't been kind to them, but it hadn't taken their decency either. Later that afternoon, as Grace left for school, Helen lingered by the window. A strange feeling gnawed at her, a quiet sense that something had shifted in the world. That night, long after Grace had gone to bed, the phone rang. The line crackled with static, and a deep voice spoke. "Ma'am, this is Commander David Thompson with the United States Navy. We're trying to confirm an address for a Helen and Grace Carter." Helen froze. "Who is this? What's going on?" There was a pause. Then the voice said, almost reverently, "It's about Admiral Thomas Peterson." By mid-morning the next day, the quiet street outside the Carter apartment was unrecognizable. Military trucks lined both curbs, their engines idling softly in the mist. Neighbors peeked through curtains, whispering as uniformed men in dark blue filed toward the small building. Grace, returning from school with her backpack bouncing against her shoulders, stopped dead in her tracks. There were soldiers everywhere, strong, serious men with the Navy SEAL trident glinting on their chests. A few glanced at her, then looked at each other in disbelief. One of them, a tall man with weathered skin and sharp gray eyes, approached slowly. "Grace Carter?" Her throat went dry. Yes, sir." The man knelt down, so they were eye level. "I'm Commander David Thompson, SEAL Team 6. We've been looking for you." "For me?" He smiled faintly, his voice gentle, but filled with awe. "You fed a man last night near the bay, didn't you?" Grace nodded, clutching her backpack straps. Thompson spoke quietly into his radio. "Eagle 1, target located. It's her." From one of the trucks came a chorus of relieved voices, and moments later, the convoy stirred into motion. Helen burst out of the building just as Thompson rose to his feet. "What is going on?" she demanded, clutching Grace's shoulders protectively. Thompson removed his cap, his tone respectful. "Ma'am, the man your daughter helped was Admiral Thomas Peterson, retired chairman of the Joint Chiefs. He went missing 2 years ago. No one knew if he was alive." Helen blinked, stunned. "You mean the Admiral?" "Yes, ma'am, the one from every history book." Thompson's eyes softened. "Your daughter saved him. He was hypothermic, disoriented, and refusing medical aid until she gave him food. He called us himself this morning. First words out of his mouth were, 'Find the little girl. She's family.'" Helen covered her mouth, speechless. Grace just stood there, the cold air biting her cheeks as her heart pounded with disbelief. Then, from behind the commander, a dozen Navy SEALs straightened in formation. One of them opened a small case, revealing a folded flag and a sealed letter. Thompson handed it to Grace. "He asked us to deliver this personally." Inside, written in neat cursive, were the words, "You reminded an old sailor what duty means. Report to base when you're ready. We've got orders from you now." The Navy sedan cut through the drizzle, heading toward the Port Madison Naval Base. Grace sat in the back seat beside her mother, her small hands folded tightly in her lap. Outside the window, the gray ocean stretched endlessly, the horizon blurred by rain. In the front seat, Commander Thompson spoke quietly into his radio, his tone crisp and professional, yet every few minutes his eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, as if still in disbelief at the little girl behind him. At the gates, guards saluted sharply. "Carter family authorized," Thompson said. The gates opened, revealing a vast expanse of gleaming hangars, runways, and barracks lined with flags rippling in the wind. As they drove deeper in, sailors paused mid-drill to watch the small civilian car pass. Some even raised their hands in salute. Helen leaned closer to her daughter. "Sweetheart, why are they doing that?" Grace whispered. "I think it's for him." When the car stopped, Thompson turned to them. "He's been waiting." They entered a medical wing, the air smelling faintly of antiseptic and sea salt. In the far corner, surrounded by doctors and Marines standing at attention, sat an elderly man in a hospital gown, his posture still impossibly straight. His silver hair was combed neatly back, and though his body looked frail, his eyes burned with command. The moment Grace stepped into the room, the old man smiled. "There you are, sailor." His voice was raspy but strong. Grace froze. "You're Admiral Peterson?" He nodded, gesturing her closer. "I was. These days I'm just Tom. But last night you were the one giving orders." Grace blushed, glancing down at her sneakers. "I just bought you soup." He chuckled softly. "Soup that probably saved my life." His gaze shifted to Helen. "And you must be her mother, the woman who raised someone brave enough to disobey fear." Helen tried to speak, but her voice broke. "Sir, we didn't—" Peterson raised a trembling hand. "You did exactly what this country was built on, compassion with no agenda." He motioned to Thompson, who stepped forward carrying a velvet box. "Grace Carter," the Admiral said formally, "by the authority vested in me, I award you the Navy's Distinguished Civilian Service Medal for reminding an old man what it means to serve." The room filled with applause. Grace's eyes shimmered as the medal was placed around her neck. Peterson leaned close and whispered, "From now on, young lady, you're my personal mission commander. First order, make sure this old fool eats his lunch every day." Grace giggled through tears. "Aye, aye, Admiral." That night, the base cafeteria buzzed with a rare kind of warmth. The smell of stew and coffee drifted through the air as officers, medics, and SEALs gathered quietly at long tables, stealing glances toward the corner where Grace sat beside Admiral Peterson. Her medal gleamed faintly under the soft lights, but she seemed more fascinated by the tiny Navy stars on his uniform than by the award itself. "Do they all listen to you?" she whispered. Peterson smiled, setting down his spoon. "They used to. Now I listen to you." Grace frowned, confused. "But I'm just a kid." He nodded thoughtfully. "Exactly. Kids remember what adults forget, that sometimes the smallest act of kindness commands the greatest respect." Across the room, Commander Thompson was watching them. His men, hardened veterans who had stormed battlefields across the world, were unusually quiet. One of them, a massive SEAL named Riker, leaned over and muttered, "I've seen presidents get less attention than that kid." Thompson smirked. "That's because presidents don't hand out soup when no one's watching." When dinner ended, Peterson insisted on walking Grace and Helen to their new quarters. The Navy had arranged everything. A seaside apartment on the edge of the base, fully furnished and stocked. Helen stared at the place in disbelief, touching the smooth wood of the banister as though it might vanish if she blinked. "This is too much," she whispered. "We can't accept—" "You can," Peterson interrupted gently, "because this isn't charity. It's gratitude. You taught my men and me that honor still lives outside our ranks." Grace wandered to the balcony where the ocean crashed against the rocks below. She could see the distant lighthouse flickering. For the first time, she didn't feel small under the vast night sky. She felt seen. Inside, Peterson sat with Helen over tea. "You remind me of my daughter," he said quietly. "Strong, stubborn, full of grace, no pun intended." He smiled at his own joke, but his eyes turned distant. "I lost her years ago. She used to tell me the Navy made me forget how to be human." Helen's expression softened. "And did it?" Maybe it did, he admitted, until last night. From the balcony came Grace's laughter, carried by the wind. Peterson's gaze followed the sound. That little girl did what medals and orders never could. She brought me home. Outside, the waves pounded the shore, steady and endless, like a salute from the sea itself. The following weeks unfolded like a dream. Every morning, Grace walked through the naval base with a lanyard around her neck that read Authorized Access, Civilian Liaison. The sailors saluted her half-jokingly, but with genuine affection. Wherever she went, people smiled. Mechanics, officers, cooks, all whispering the same story. The little girl who fed the admiral. Admiral Peterson had recovered faster than his doctors expected. Though still frail, he spent hours in his office overlooking the sea, with Grace perched in a chair beside him, drawing in her sketchbook while he read reports. Sometimes she'd look up and ask the kind of questions no adult dared to. Why do wars start if everyone wants peace? Or did you ever feel scared even when you were brave? Every time, Peterson answered honestly, "Yes, Grace, every soldier feels fear. Courage isn't the absence of it. It's doing what's right, even when you're shaking." One afternoon, while they played chess, Commander Thompson entered with a stack of folders. "Sir, the Defense Department approved the Admiral's request. The Carter eviction notice has been rescinded, and the family's debts cleared." Helen, who had just walked in carrying sandwiches, froze. "I don't understand. We didn't ask for that." Peterson looked up with that familiar twinkle in his eyes. "You didn't have to. The Navy repays its debts of honor." Grace's eyes widened. "So we're safe?" "Safe and then some," Thompson said, smiling. "Your mom's going back to nursing school, full scholarship." The Admiral insisted. Helen covered her face with her hands, trembling. "I don't know how to thank you." Peterson stood slowly, resting a steady hand on her shoulder. "Raise that daughter of yours just as she is. That's all the thanks I'll ever need." That evening, the Admiral asked to take a walk along the pier. The sunset painted the water in molten gold. He moved slowly, leaning on his cane, Grace beside him every step. "You know," he said quietly, "when I was your age, I thought heroes wore uniforms. But the truth is, they just show up when someone needs them." Grace tilted her head. "Then you're still one." He smiled faintly. "No, sweetheart, you are." As they reached the end of the pier, a flock of seagulls burst into the sky, wings flashing white against the dying light. The Admiral saluted the horizon. Grace, imitating him, lifted her small hand beside his. 2 generations, one ending, one beginning, stood together at the edge of the world. News of the mysterious little girl who saved the missing admiral spread across the country within days. Newspapers called her the $5 hero. TV anchors replayed footage of Grace walking beside Admiral Peterson on the pier, their salutes captured against the sunset. Even the president sent a letter, thanking her for reminding the nation that compassion is still our greatest act of service. At first, Helen tried to shield her daughter from the attention. The flood of reporters outside their apartment made it nearly impossible to leave without flash bulbs exploding. But Admiral Peterson handled it with the same calm authority that had once commanded fleets. Standing at a press conference in full uniform, he said firmly, "Grace Carter is not a headline. She is a reminder. We will honor her example not by talking about it, but by living it." The next day, donations began pouring in from across the world. Scholarships, housing funds for veterans, and thousands of handwritten letters. Helen wept as she read them aloud. Some came from soldiers' widows, some from school children, others from men who admitted they'd once ignored a homeless veteran and would never do so again. But not everyone celebrated. A group of cynical commentators called the story a publicity stunt, claiming the admiral was exaggerating. One morning, a reporter shoved a microphone at Grace as she walked into base school and asked, "Are you proud that people say you're just part of a Navy PR plan?" Grace froze. Before she could answer, a deep voice boomed from behind her. "That's enough." Admiral Peterson appeared, his cane striking the pavement like a command. He moved slowly, but stood tall, his medals glinting under the morning sun. "Son," he said to the reporter, "you don't know what pride is until you've been saved by someone with nothing left to give." The crowd fell silent. Even the cameras lowered. Grace reached for his hand, her small fingers wrapping around his weathered ones. The admiral turned to her, his tone softer now. "People will always try to measure kindness, but kindness doesn't fit on a scale. It just echoes." He led her away, his cane tapping in rhythm with her steps. That evening, when they returned home, they found their front yard filled with veterans, hundreds of them, standing shoulder to shoulder in quiet formation. Men and women of every age, some missing limbs, some holding folded flags. Commander Thompson stepped forward, his voice steady. "Admiral Peterson, Miss Carter, these are the ones your kindness reached." Grace looked up at her great-grandfather, speechless. He nodded, eyes glistening. "You see, Grace? When you throw a pebble of goodness into the sea, it comes back as a wave." Then, for the first time in years, the old admiral saluted, not to a superior, not to a flag, but to the little girl who had reminded him what it meant to serve. Months passed, and the world slowly moved on from headlines, but for Grace and Helen, life had only just begun to bloom. Their seaside apartment overlooked the same stretch of water where everything had changed, and each morning Grace stood at the balcony, saluting the sunrise before heading to school on base. Her backpack now carried not just books, but small notes from sailors, medics, and veterans who treated her like one of their own. Admiral Peterson's health improved steadily. Though his steps remained slow, his spirit seemed lighter, his laughter louder. Every Thursday, Grace would arrive at his quarters with a thermos of soup, chicken noodle, his favorite, and they would sit together for hours. He told her stories of the sea, storms that nearly sank ships, brothers lost and found, and the secret promise every sailor made, to always come back home. "You know," he said one afternoon, gazing out the window, "you taught me something the Navy never could. We spend our lives defending freedom, but sometimes we forget that kindness is part of what keeps it alive." Grace smiled, sipping her cocoa. "Then I guess we're both soldiers, just different kinds." He chuckled. "You're the better one." Meanwhile, Helen had returned to nursing school with full funding from a Navy scholarship. She worked long hours balancing study and part-time shifts at the base clinic, but for the first time in years, she felt purpose instead of exhaustion. On weekends, she and Grace cooked big dinners for the sailors, the kitchen echoing with laughter and the smell of bread baking. One rainy evening, as thunder rolled in from the sea, Grace noticed a young sailor struggling outside the commissary, his groceries scattered across the wet pavement. Without hesitation, she dashed into the rain, helping him gather everything back into the bags. When she returned, soaked to the skin, Admiral Peterson was waiting in his chair by the window. He'd seen the whole thing. She didn't even think, Helen said, half exasperated, half proud. Peterson smiled, his voice quiet but sure. That's how you know the lesson stuck. He turned to Grace. Your mother worries this world will harden you, but she shouldn't. Some hearts are built like ships, tested by every storm, yet never sinking. That night, as lightning flashed over the waves, Peterson handed Grace a small wooden box. Inside lay his old compass, its brass edges worn smooth by decades of service. For when you lose your way, he said softly, it always points home. Years later, when Grace would grow up to found the Anchor Project, a national program providing meals and housing for homeless veterans, people would ask her what inspired her. She would smile and say, just one bowl of soup, and a man who reminded me that no act of kindness ever drifts away. The sea kept roaring, the lighthouse kept shining, and somewhere in that endless horizon, the compass needle still pointed true.